Welcome to Her Remarkable History. Remember, to support our channel, please subscribe. The disturbing story of Elizabeth I's heart. Following her death, Elizabeth I was embalmed by the royal doctors against her wishes. During this brutal preservation of her body, her heart and her entrails were cut out and were removed. It was something Elizabeth did not want, as the Tudor Queen wanted her body to remain intact and then buried. It was common during the 16th and 17th century for the internal organs of kings and queens and important people to be removed and buried elsewhere, but Elizabeth's heart had remained the source of debate throughout the years. When she came onto the throne, many people across the country doubted her, as they believed she was a weak woman, and they would have preferred a king. Elizabeth would give a speech to soldiers who would defend her country from the Spanish Armada, and in this she said, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England too." But following her death, Elizabeth's heart was cut out and was removed, and it was held somewhere else. But then one man would open the box containing her heart, and what he found was shocking. But what is the story of Elizabeth I's heart? Over the last few years of Elizabeth I's life, she was greatly depressed, and towards the end she had given up. She had lost what made her a brilliant and determined queen, as many of her friends passed away and her senior advisers died. With this, Elizabeth became very morose, and she would spend long amounts of time contemplating on her reign. She was a woman who had sentenced Mary, Queen of Scots, to death, and ordering her execution was something she believed would prevent her from going to heaven. But Elizabeth's impending death had caused a significant amount of stress in England, as she did not have an heir, and she died being known as the Virgin Queen. But the Queen's health remained fair until 1602. At this time, negotiations had occurred for James VI of Scotland to unite the thrones of Scotland and England, following Elizabeth's death. Now Elizabeth, in the winter of 1602, had caught a chill following walking out in the winter air, and she complained of a sore throat and aches and pains. She would often spend time laying on her cushions saying, "I am not well." But she refused access to the royal doctors. She seemed to want to die, and she was at this time old, tired and lonely, and she was ready to leave the world she had once loved and had spent a lot of time ruling over her people. As Elizabeth became more ill, the Archbishop Whitgift was summoned by her side, and he held on to her hand. He spoke to her about getting better, and she made no response. But when he spoke to her about heaven, she squeezed the bishop's hand. She could not by this time speak, and she was beyond gestures. It was clear that Elizabeth was dying at the time. It was then said of the bishop and Elizabeth's exchange that he examined her first of her faith, and she so punctually answered all of his several questions by lifting up her eyes and holding up her hand, and it was a comfort to all the beholders. Then the good man told her plainly what she was, and what she was to come to, and though she had been long a great queen here upon earth, yet shortly she was to yield an account of her stewardship to the King of Kings. After this he began to pray, and all that were by did answer him. After he had continued long into prayer, till the old man's knees were weary, he blessed her, and meant to rise and leave her. The Queen made a sign with her hand. My sister, knowing her meaning, told the bishop the Queen desired he would pray still. He did so for a long half-hour after, and then thought to leave her. The second time she made sign to have him continue in prayer. He did so for half an hour more, with earnest cries to God for her soul's health, which he uttered with the feverest of spirit. As the Queen to all our sight much rejoiced thereat, and gave testimony to us all of her Christian and comfortable end. By this time it grew late, and every one departed, all but her women that attended her. In the hours after, Queen Elizabeth I died, and the Queen had specified for some time that she did not want a post-mortem, and that she did not want to be embalmed. She wanted to be left inside of a coffin after her death and to be laid in state, but her advisers and the royal doctors made the heartbreaking decision to not adhere to her wishes, and they then would cut her open, and they would make the preparations to embalm her. The doctors then removed the Queen's heart and entrails, and these were removed and then placed inside of a leaden casket. It was common then for these parts of the remains of royal people to be placed inside of caskets which were then buried elsewhere. This happened to Mary Queen of Scots, who was initially buried in Peterborough Cathedral, but her heart and entrails were buried at Fotheringhay Castle, where she was executed. The same happened with Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third wife, who died following childbirth at Hampton Court Palace, and it's believed that Jane's heart was placed under the altar in the Chapel Royal where she died, but her body was then placed in a vault in St George's Chapel in Windsor Castle. The royal doctors removed Elizabeth's heart and placed it into a casket. However, the funeral would then take place. Elizabeth I was buried inside of Westminster Abbey, and she was buried with great pomp and ceremony. She was initially placed inside the same vault of her grandfather, Henry VII, but was then moved during the reign of her successor, who commissioned a great tomb for her to be made. It was said Queen Elizabeth was interred with great pomp in Westminster Abbey, at which time the city of Westminster was surcharged with multitudes of all sorts of people in the streets, houses and windows and gutters, who came to see the obsequy. And when they beheld her statue or effigy lying on the coffin, set forth in royal robes, having a crown upon the head thereof, and a ball and a sceptre in either hand, there was such a great sighing, groaning, and weeping, as the like have not been seen or known in the memory of man, neither does any history mention any people, time, or state. The same effigy or statue used for Elizabeth I, it's believed, is still inside of Westminster Abbey. But Elizabeth was buried inside of the same vault and grave as her sister Mary I. Another account says, the corpse of the late Queen lay in state at St James's for more than 3 weeks whilst the mourning clothes and funeral arrangements were prepared. On December 12th, when all was ready, her funeral cortege formed in the courtyard of the palace for the solemn procession of Westminster. The procession halted at the great door of Westminster Abbey, and the Queen's coffin was carried inside. 100 poor men in black gowns kept watch over her body all that night, holding long torches in their hands, and around them the soldiers of the Royal Guard stood with their staff torches. The next day the Requiem Mass was sung. When the eulogy was over the coffin, it was carried to Henry VII's chapel in the Abbey, and placed in a grave on the north side. Her heart, being severally enclosed in a coffin covered with velvet bound with silver, was separately interred. The household officers broke their staves and threw them into the grave. As they did so, the trumpets sounded to signal the beginning of the funeral banquet. The chief mourners went to dinner, leaving the funeral trappings unguarded. In a few minutes the servants and hired mourners and the Londoners who had come to see the Queen laid in her grave had torn down the banners and standards, the arms displayed around the altar, and the hangings fastened to the wall. They scrambled and fought one another for scraps of cloth, until the embroidered cloths were in shreds, and the Queen's effigy pulled into 100 pieces. But what happened to the heart and entrails? Well, these for some reason were not buried in the place where she died, but instead were taken to Westminster Abbey, where they were kept in a vessel nearby the vault, or inside of the vault. We know this as there is a story of a young boy who allegedly found the box which Mary I and Elizabeth I's hearts were placed into. This boy, named William Taswell, later became a priest of a church in Bermondsey, and he said that when he was a praying boy inside of Westminster Abbey, he had come across the depositories, and when he opened the box, he was greeted by the sight of the hearts of 2 queens which had been held for decades. It was 1670, and Elizabeth had been dead for over 60 years, but her heart was intact. William Taswell then wrote, In the beginning of 1670, the royal vault was opened for the funeral of monk Duke of Albemarle. Within niches were the urns, one with the name Queen Mary, the other with that of Queen Elizabeth. I dipped my hand into each and took out of each a king of gluttonous red substance, some of what resembles mortar. Mary's urn contained the least moisture. This means that this young boy had touched the heart and remains of 2 Tudor queens. But what was strange is that this young boy was given access to the royal vaults under the floor of Westminster Abbey, and that following this, he then came across the reliquaries containing the hearts of not just Elizabeth, but also Mary. He then reached into the box and touched the heart of Elizabeth, which had then been removed. This is something we must remember that the Queen did not want. She wanted following her death to be left in one piece, but her remains were messed up, and this was in a sense a disgrace. The story of her heart was shocking, and was something that shouldn't have happened, with her remains being tampered with years after her death. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.